Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question in a video I mentioned yesterday, even talking about sleep and why some of these sleep products aren't that useful. I had mentioned eating carbs before bed and melatonin release, which is your body's sleep hormone, and someone comes in and they say, hey Jason, but isn't it true? Because I've read that eating a lot of carbs before bed could blunt growth hormone response and release in the body. Is that true? So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright guys, this is the sort of stuff that we really have to be careful of that's out there in the community, stuff that people come up with as a hypothetical, and let's keep in mind, these are usually not even people with any sort of science background who come up with these hypothetical things, and then people start basing what they do based upon that. Like they actually start changing what they do because they're afraid of some transient shift in hormones in their body affecting their gains in some way, and they end up doing dumb things like that. Alright guys, the simple reality. Yes, insulin itself, elevated insulin, can cause growth hormone production to go down. But what you need to remember is that, number one, insulin is dramatically more anabolic to muscle tissue than growth hormone is. So for someone trying to gain muscle, if you were to try to cause your body to have shifts in different hormones, lowering insulin to raise GH would be the last thing you would ever want to do if you were trying to gain muscle. People need to understand, insulin doesn't cause fat gain in athletic people. Elevated insulin, like really elevated insulin levels that people think of as insulin spiking, only happens in like sedentary obese people. People who work out don't need to worry about things like that because your body produces far less insulin because your muscles have such a high insulin sensitivity, because insulin is very anabolic to them. It's more anabolic to your muscle tissue than it is your fat by an enormous margin. It's not even close for most people who are athletic and work out. They have a lower insulin response. All right, you don't see big, really high circulating insulin levels even from eating white rice and white bread and stuff in people who lift weights several times a week vigorously. You don't see that happen. It doesn't happen in the lab with athletic people. That's sedentary fat people that happens to, people who don't work out, people who don't exercise. Don't get these things confused. So your insulin levels aren't going to go up that much. The other thing to consider there, growth hormone, two problems with that. Number one, growth hormone isn't actually that anabolic in the sense of people who don't have low growth hormone levels. People who don't have really low growth hormone levels don't gain less muscle because their normal levels go down up and down through the day. People who don't have a problem with their pituitary gland, you're going to produce the same amount of growth hormone every day no matter what you do. Meaning what you do might cause it to rise or drop, but it always balances out in the end. Meaning if you lift weights, your growth hormone goes up. But then it drops later to lower to compensate because your body's not going to produce very much more or less than it intended to produce based upon your pituitary gland. It doesn't really get affected over the course of 24 hours or 2 days or 3 days by your physical activity, your diet. It will balance itself out. So if you do something that spikes it in some way, weight training, it lowers it later to make sure it gets the same amount through the day, right? And if you suppress it, it will have a rebound the other direction. Now, interestingly enough, what's one of the things that causes growth hormone to elevate? Melatonin. Eating carbs causes your melatonin to go up. That's why people get really sleepy after they binge on a bunch of sweets and carbs sometimes, because your sleep hormone kicks in. Well, what happens, yeah, okay, insulin goes up some extent because, you know, you're eating carbs, but if you're athletic, it's not going to go up enormously. It's not going to be like some really high level where it's dangerous or something crazy or that's going to make you fat. It's going to go up, then melatonin is going to go up. Insulin's going to go down. As melatonin goes up, the growth hormone is going to go up. So in theory, if you were trying to get more of it produced during your sleep cycles, eating carbs before bed over the course of a 6 or 7 or 8 hour sleeping session would probably cause it to elevate a little bit. That's a reasonable assumption, and here's the other thing with it. It doesn't even produce much muscle gains, meaning people who have really low growth hormone levels, just because they have a problem with their pituitary gland, alright, they gain less muscle. But people have this weird idea that spiking growth hormone somehow causes measurable muscle growth. It doesn't. In fact, studies have been done on people who were given 3 or 4 times the amount your body produces naturally. They're given that in an injection in the morning. If it's taken by itself with no anabolics, no testosterone, even people using it synthetically, doesn't cause a measurable amount of muscle growth. They don't gain enough muscle from it that it can be measured. It's not that anabolic. It's that it has a synergistic effect with certain other hormones is the reason people use it. It has some recovery benefits, things like that. Growth hormone doesn't cause muscle growth, at least any very significant amount. It's a very, very small amount. Like, it doesn't cause... You're not going to gain an extra pound of muscle a year just by putting growth hormone into your body. Let me put it that way, if that's all you did different. It might be an ounce, 2 ounces over a year, maybe. So it's not as powerful in that regard as people think. It has a synergistic effect with other substances. It can have some recovery benefits. It can help with fat burning, things like that. It can blunt fat gain. But it's not particularly anabolic in and of itself. So people get way too hung up on that. And they get hung up on these transient fluctuations. You know what? There's been a lot of studies done, and normally you can't make enough changes of spiking of things like your growth hormone, testosterone, or whatever through normal activities, diet, supplementation, exercise to actually cause a measurable amount of muscle growth, like those fluctuations you cause day to day. That you usually can't have enough impact on any of those to significantly impact your muscle gains. And that's been noted by the research over the years, yet people obsess over these things and they micromanage these things that don't actually matter. And the reality is, you know what, as far as producing less growth hormone when you sleep from eating a bunch of carbs before bed, people say that, right? But you know what? Not one study has ever been produced showing that happening. So people have a theory. I theorize this will happen. Well, I gave you guys a good theory showing the other direction too, didn't I? And that makes sense also. If you understand the ebb and flow of the cycles of this, your body's production of this hormone. But the thing is, they have a theory that has never, there's no data, not one study, not even a rat study, showing that their theory is based on reality. It was just a hypothesis some bodybuilding magazine reader or writer came up with one day. That's it. That's all it is. And yet people will actually modify their life based on it. I can assure you most top athletes around the world eat carbs before bed. Again, if you want to fuel recovery and muscle growth and you want to get a better night's sleep, that's probably a good idea. So again, people micromanage things that don't really matter. They get caught up in these theories that don't really matter. You know what? It was the same thing when people were saying, don't eat carbs immediately after you work out now because of this. So people went from saying you had to have carbs to work out to some bodybuilding coach, what's his name, George Farah, was telling people, oh, I don't have my athletes eat carbs plus workout because the insulin response could blunt growth hormone. He has them eat protein. But protein shakes cause an insulin response too. Almost pretty much as high as carbs, gram per gram. We'd have them do protein, but he also has guys who are injecting growth hormone, so why would he even care about what their body produces post-workout? And that was the other thing. Do you guys know that the studies of meta-analysis that looks at it have found that the amount of growth hormone that a person produces during and post-training doesn't have any impact on their muscle growth? That's also been studied. It doesn't seem to have any effect on the amount of muscle you gain from the workout. So people get hung up on things that don't really matter. These things don't matter at all, and yet people will modify their lifestyle based upon a completely unproven hypothesis that actually doesn't really even make sense. And even if there was some truth to it, it really wouldn't even matter. And again, ultimately, if a person was trying to gain muscle, why in the world would they be scared of normal, healthy insulin responses to their food? If you don't get an insulin response to food, you're not going to gain muscle anyways. You're not going to gain any muscle without a significant insulin response to food. In fact, you're going to start losing muscle. Insulin is extremely anabolic to people who lift weights. It's anabolic. In fact, it will put far more muscle on you than growth hormone will. In the amounts that your body produces naturally of either one of these hormones as a response to your training, your food, everything else, for people who lift weights, insulin response in their body is actually dramatically more anabolic to your muscle tissue than your growth hormone response is. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.